Well, good morning. Please be seated. On behalf of the First Family, welcome to the White House. And welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Just over 2 months ago, on May the 11th, President Trump signed an executive order to create a commission to, in his words, help to, quote, promote fair and honest federal elections, the foundation of our democracy. Election integrity matters to every American. President Calvin Coolidge reminded us, in his words, that, quote, the whole system of American government rests on the ballot box. And President Reagan declared that, quote, the right to vote is the crown jewel of American liberties. By establishing this commission, President Trump is taking action to ensure that the ballot box remains inviolate and that the crown jewel shines brighter than ever before. At the President's direction, I'll have the honor to serve as chairman of this commission, and it's a privilege to convene this first meeting today. President Trump knows that the integrity of our electoral system transcends party lines, and I'm grateful this commission has brought together a distinguished group of bipartisan election experts and public officials from federal, state, and the local level. And together, this bipartisan group will perform a truly nonpartisan service to the American people. I'd especially like to recognize our vice chairman, who you'll hear more from after the president's remarks, a man whose long service has established him as a national leader on election integrity, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach. I also, as a point of personal privilege, would like to express my thanks and appreciation to Indiana's Secretary of State, Connie Lawson, who joins us as a part of this panel. President Trump knows that the principle of one person, one vote is foundational to the American system of democracy. This commission has been charged to study the registration and voting processes used in federal elections. The commission will identify the laws, rules, policies, activities, strategies, and practices that will enhance the American people's confidence in the integrity of our electoral system. We'll also explore the vulnerabilities in our system that could lead to improper voter registration and even improper voting. This commission, let me be clear, this commission has no preconceived notions or preordained results. We're fact finders, and in the days ahead, we will gather the relevant facts and data, and at the conclusion of our work, we will present the President with a report of our findings. I'm confident this commission will have a healthy and robust debate, but the President and I expect nothing less, because respectful debate is also a hallmark of our democracy, and I know that we'll find many areas of common ground as well. I'm pleased to report the Commission has already started its work requesting publicly available data, and we are grateful for the more than 30 states that have already indicated their intention to provide this information pursuant to the laws of their states. Today is just the first of several meetings that the Commission will hold in the coming months. Today we will hear from each of the Commission's members. Each of you brings a unique perspective based on your experience and your research, and we welcome your participation and your insights. I'd like to note that our commission includes 5 current and former Secretaries of State, and Secretary Kobach and I look forward to working with each one of you as the chief election officers from across America to foster a collaborative and respectful relationship for the benefit of your state's voters and our nation's electoral process. And finally, as the Commission on Election Integrity begins its work, I'd like to personally invite the American people to offer their public comments and input on our work and the challenges and opportunities that face our electoral system. We want to hear the voice of the American voter, because that's really what this is all about. You know, it's the greatest privilege of my life to serve as Vice President to a president who cares so deeply about the integrity of America's elections and the right of each and every American to see the sanctity of their vote protected. This president knows that the success of our democracy depends on the American people's confidence in this electoral system. And the president and I are both confident that this bipartisan commission will make the strongest democracy in the history of the world even stronger. And so, with gratitude for his commitment to fair and honest elections, it is my high honor and distinct privilege to introduce to all of you the 45th President of the United States of America, President Donald Trump.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Please be seated. Thank you. Mr. Vice President, distinguished guests and members of the media, I'm honored to welcome you here today as the bipartisan Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity prepares to conduct its first official meeting. Very, very important. This commission is tasked with the sacred duty of upholding the integrity of the ballot box and the principle of one citizen, one vote. Every time voter fraud occurs, it cancels out the vote of a lawful citizen and undermines democracy. Can't let that happen. Any form of illegal or fraudulent voting, whether by non-citizens or the deceased, and any form of voter suppression or intimidation must be stopped. I'm pleased that more than 30 states have already agreed to share the information with the Commission, and the other states, that information will be forthcoming. If any state does not want to share this information, one has to wonder what they're worried about. And I asked the Vice President, I asked the Commission, what are they worried about? There's something. There always is. This issue is very important to me because throughout the campaign and even after it, people would come up to me and express their concerns about voter inconsistencies and irregularities, which they saw. In some cases, having to do with very large numbers of people in certain states. All public officials have a profound responsibility to protect the integrity of the vote. We have no choice. We want to make America great again. We have to protect the integrity of the vote and our voters. This is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It's an American issue. It's about the concern of so many Americans that improper voting has taken place and canceling out the votes of lawful American citizens. That is why President Theodore Roosevelt once said, "It is the affair of every honest voter, wherever born, to see that no fraudulent voting is allowed anywhere." I want to thank Vice President Pence for chairing the commission. I also want to thank Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach for serving as vice chair. It's going to be a lot of work. They're going to work very hard over a fairly short period of time, and I want to thank you both very much, Chris, Mike. This is a bipartisan panel consisting of both Republican and Democratic leaders and experts on voter integrity. I would like to personally thank each of our panel members for serving. Really do appreciate it. In addition to the chair and vice chair, this distinguished bipartisan panel includes Indiana Secretary of State Connie Lawson. Thank you. New Hampshire Secretary of State Bill Gardner. Thank you. Maine Secretary of State Matthew Dunlop. Former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell. Election Assistance Commissioner Christy McCormick. Thank you. Former Arkansas State Representative David Dunn. Thank you, David. Wood County, West Virginia Clerk Mark Rhodes. Heritage Foundation Senior Legal Fellow and Manager of the Election Law Reform Initiative, a real expert, Hans von Spackowski. President and General Counsel of the Public Interest Legal Foundation, great group, J. Christian Adams, and Jefferson County, Alabama probate judge Alan King. Thank you. Thank you very much. Each of you has been entrusted with the great responsibility of helping to advance the cause of fair, honest, and lawful elections. Your work will help protect our democracy. This will be a very transparent process. It's going to be very open for everybody to see. You will approach this important task with a very open mind and with no conclusions already drawn. You will fairly and objectively follow the facts wherever they may lead. I look forward to the findings and recommendations your report will produce, and I share your report as soon as I can and as soon as possible with the American people so the full truth will be known and exposed if necessary in the light of day. We call on every state to give its full support and total cooperation in this effort. Most of them have really done brilliantly, and we appreciate it, and the rest, all of that information will be forthcoming. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, and Chris, thank you. Panel, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Do a great job. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to call the first meeting of the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity to order. Our first order of business is to recognize each of our members and to make introductions and brief remarks. I'd like to start with a few comments of my own in addition to the remarks that I made from the podium. First and foremost, let me commend each one of you for stepping forward to serve your country in this capacity. As you heard from the President and from me earlier, we are truly grateful for your willingness to step forward. This is a bipartisan group that will perform a nonpartisan service to the American people. Our goal, as the executive order asserts, is to help promote free and honest federal elections. Our charge is to study the registration and voting processes used in federal elections. And, as I mentioned earlier, our charge is to explore vulnerabilities in the system that could lead to improper voting registration and improper voting. But let me reiterate the point I made earlier, now that we're on the record. We have no preconceived notions or preordained results. Our duty is to go where the facts lead and to provide the President and the American people with a report on our findings that can be used to strengthen the American people's confidence in our electoral system. And as you heard, the President looks forward to what we accomplish, and so do I. And I look very much forward to hearing from each and every one of you. The President and I have meetings scheduled soon after this with a number of senators, so my hope is that I'll be able to hear from each and every one of you before excusing myself to hear from members of the United States Senate on another matter. But I'm very, very grateful that you're here. We'd like to ask that you limit your remarks, your opening remarks, to 5 minutes or less. There is a timer in the back, but I know we can go on the honor system here with each one of you, and we appreciate your sensitivity. I'd like to start by recognizing our distinguished Vice Chair, the Kansas Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, and Mr. Secretary, you are now recognized with the gratitude of the President and this administration for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. It's indeed a great honor to serve as Vice Chairman of this Commission. The charge of the Commission is a significant one, as the President outlined, to study the threats to the integrity of our elections, to quantify those threats if possible, and if it's the will of the Commission, to offer recommendations to the President to help ensure the integrity of future elections in this country. And most importantly, to share that information after the report is made to the President, to share that information with the American public. This is a mission of the highest order. I've often thought that at the very foundation of our republic are really two bedrock things: the American Constitution and the faith and reality that our elections are conducted fairly. If you take away either of those two things, I believe that our republic cannot stand for long. So for a long time, there's been lingering doubt among many Americans about the integrity and fairness of elections, and it's not a new issue at all. If you look at the polling data, it goes back decades. Public opinion has been consistent on this, in that there is a substantial number of people who wonder if our elections are fair. A 2014 survey showed that only 40% of voters thought elections were fair to the voters, which indicates that 60% either did not think so or were undecided. We owe it to the American people to take a hard, dispassionate look at the subject And throughout our country's history, there have been specific historical episodes that we may have learned of in school or in college of voter fraud, and those may have received a great deal of attention. And individual states from time to time may have investigated specific allegations of voter fraud or have done some specific investigation of voter fraud. For example, in my state of Kansas, we're engaged in litigation right now defending our proof of citizenship requirements at the time of registration. And we've engaged in extensive fact-finding for the federal courts involved and have discovered 128 specific cases of non-citizens who either registered to vote or attempted to register to vote. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. One expert in the case estimated that the total number could be in excess of 18,000 on our voter rolls. But there's never been a nationwide effort to do some sort of analysis of this scope and scale, to quantify and analyze the various forms of threats to our elections' integrity. This commission will have the ability to find answers to questions that have never been fully answered before and to conduct research that has never been conducted before. And that research will not be buried. We respect the voters' privacy and will not identify individual voters with our voter roll data, but we will lay out factual findings and systematic problems that we can identify in our electoral systems. And those results, whatever they are, will be made public for the American people to draw their own conclusions from. In 2013, President Obama established a Presidential Commission on Election Administration, and he did so, among other things, to analyze a problem that had been reported in several states in the 2012 election, and that was long lines at the polling places. When someone drives to a polling place and sees a long line, 2 blocks long, there's a chance that that person may decide it's not worth it for me to vote and turn around and drive home. Similarly, if someone lives in a place where voter fraud has been known to occur in the past and the elections in the past may have been stolen, there's a chance that he or she will decide that his vote is not likely to count, or it will be counterbalanced by the fraud, and therefore decide not to vote in that case. These are both problems worthy of investigation and worthy of a presidential commission. In Kansas, for the last 11 years, we've hosted the Interstate Cross-Check System, in which approximately 30 states participate. We annually compare our voter rolls to each other, and in so doing, we find literally millions of people that are probable double registrations, where the same person is registered in more than one state. With that information, the participating states can begin the process of keeping their voter rolls accurate and up to date. It's a starting point where the state can then contact the voters in question and, with the voters' consent, remove them from the voter rolls of the state that in which he no longer resides, or else using a process laid out by the National Voter Registration Act. The program also develops leads where it appears that the same person may have actually voted twice in the same election in 2 different jurisdictions. After further investigation, a prosecution for double voting may be appropriate. This program, hosted by Kansas and in 30 states, illustrates how a successful multi-state effort can be in enhancing the integrity of our elections and in keeping our voter rolls accurate. I'm confident that this commission will be equally successful on the national level. The talent, experience, and expertise of my fellow members of the commission is truly impressive. Thank you all for giving your time and your energy to this endeavor. I'm really looking forward to beginning our work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your opening remarks, and thank you for your leadership on this commission. We look forward very much to working with you. With that, I'd like to recognize my friend and fellow Hoosier, Indiana Secretary of State, Connie Lawson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Vice President, Vice Chairman Kobach, and distinguished commission members and fellow citizens. It really and truly is an honor for me to join the commission today, and I want to thank President Trump for the chance to serve in this capacity. I am Connie Lawson. I'm the Indiana Secretary of State. I also serve as president of the Bipartisan National Association of Secretaries of State, and in that role, I co-chair the NAS Election Security Task Force. I think my background is uniquely situated to the issue of voting processes and election administration. I served on the local level 2 terms as the Hendricks County Clerk, overseeing, actually, after the 2000 election. It really and truly was the beginning of the move towards electronic voting and modernization of voting machines. I was very involved in the association, becoming president and legislative chair as well. Following my time in local office, I served 16 years as state senator. During that time, the entire 16 years, I was a member of the Senate Elections Committee. I did become the majority floor leader in the Indiana Senate, I think as a result of my respect in that work. In 2012, a vacancy arose in the Secretary of State's office, and Governor Mitch Daniels appointed me to serve the remainder of the term, and I was elected to a full term in 2014. It really and truly is an honor to be here with my distinguished fellow commissioners to discuss issues related to voting systems and processes around the country. With statewide elections in New Jersey and Virginia this year, and many more contests to follow in 2018, there is no better time to analyze how we can improve voter confidence and civic participation. While it's important to create an accurate understanding of the 2016 cycle, I believe that it's even more important for us to be discussing what lies ahead. This body has a great opportunity to outline constructive priorities as we begin our work. I would submit that one of the most important goals we have is improving the partnership between federal and state authorities where election issues are concerned. For instance, I and other secretaries have been frustrated by attempts to communicate with the Federal Department of Homeland Security in their wake of their decision to designate election systems as critical infrastructure. The situation is improving, but it doesn't help when I'm still discovering facts about this decision through the media rather than from the decision makers, and I'm hopeful that we can address this issue going forward. While I was state senator, significant updates were made to federal and state election law. Among those was the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, passed in 2002. It was passed to improve voting systems and voter access in response to the 2000 election. This legislation created the Election Assistance Commission and addressed provisional voting, voting equipment, statewide voter databases, among other things. A crucial point is that the HAVA standards were developed in a bipartisan, cooperative manner, seeking input from multiple stakeholders in order to find points of agreement. It's my hope that this commission will operate in a similar manner as we get to work on behalf of the President, our states, and the American people. Thank you.
And thank you, Madam Secretary. Appreciate your remarks very much. And now the chair recognizes the former Secretary of State for the great state of Ohio, Ken Blackwell.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm honored to be a member of this commission. I want to thank you, Vice President Pence, for your leadership in this endeavor and express my gratitude to all of my colleagues for their willingness to undertake this important work. This commission and its task is to identify every threat to the integrity of the electoral process, both foreign and domestic. We are to serve the American people by enumerating the vulnerabilities of our electoral system and recommending countermeasures to protect the voting rights of the American people, as guaranteed by the Constitution. I would like to offer into the record my work of constitutional law on this issue. I co-authored this work with Ken Kukowski, a respected constitutional attorney, I'm going to say from Indiana. Our law review article is entitled "The Other Voting Right, Protecting Every Citizen's Vote by Safeguarding the Integrity of the Ballot Box," published by the Yale Law and Policy Review. We set forth that one way to articulate the right to vote secured by the Constitution is that every properly registered adult has the right to an undiluted vote. Each elector has the right to a vote that carries its full weight, and that when it is tallied, has its maximum proper effect to give that citizen a full voice in determining who among us will be entrusted with the powers of government for a term of office. As we explain in our article, this really means the Constitution secures two voting rights. The first is the one we talk about most often, the franchise, the right to cast a ballot on Election Day. Most voting laws combat abuses rooted in the past that denied Americans access to the voting booth. But there's a second right that accompanies the right to cast a ballot, and that is the right of the citizen, a citizen's legal ballot not being diluted or counseled by anyone else's illegal activity. That activity could be voter fraud by casting a ballot in more than one precinct or state. It could be a non-citizen voting, whether that non-citizen is a legal alien or an illegal alien, if they are not citizens. Then their ballots dilute the votes of American citizens. The illegal activities, the illegal activity could be voter intimidation or voter registration fraud, or it could be foreign interference in our elections, whether from Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, or any other foreign power. This other voting right is a fundamental constitutional right against any such dilution or cancellation. And it is our commission's work and our mandate from the President of the United States to identify these threats and safeguard against them. Another topic explored in our article is that voting is perhaps the only fundamental right secured by the Constitution that is also a citizen's duty. We all have the right to the free exercise of religion, or to keep and bear arms, for example, but our form of government does not impose them upon us as duties. But when it comes to voting, the Constitution enables election officials to presume that publicly spirited citizens with due concern for the course of the state and national policy would be willing to satisfy reasonable regulations and should shoulder incidental burdens in the fulfillment of their civic duty. My home state of Ohio is the jurisdiction of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Among the judges on that bench is Alice Batchelder. 2 years ago, in Russell versus Grimes, Judge Batchelder wrote, "Citizens cannot demand as constitutional entitlement an environment in which fulfilling this civic duty is effortless." To the contrary, Judge Batchelder added, "The Constitution allows for the possibility that citizens should be expected to overcome minimum obstacles when voting." Every patriotic citizen who is a qualified elector has a solemn duty in our democratic republic to participate in public debate by casting a thoughtful, informed, and deliberate ballot on Election Day. We are a self-governing people. The machinery of democracy on Election Day is the cornerstone of how we govern ourselves. This commission's duty is to catalog every threat to that machinery and determine how to thwart each threat and thereby safeguard the integrity of the ballot box. Mr. Chairman, I ask that this article and my extended remarks be made part of the record today, today's proceedings and the work of the commission. Thank you so much, sir.
Your law review article and your extended remarks are submitted to the record without objection. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your opening remarks. With that, I'd like to recognize the Secretary of State of Maine, Secretary Matt Dunlop, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I apologize I don't have any prepared remarks, so I'll try to keep it within the 45-minute allotment. Our experience in Maine is really been a truly gracious one, and we are very, very blessed to have the commitment of so many incredibly devoted and dedicated people across the state in the 503 towns and 425 unorganized territories of the state of Maine. An area from Fort Kent to Kittery and from Aquasic to Eastport, the people that I work with in elections, I'm the chief elections officer of the state of Maine, but the actual election is run by those local town officials who put an extraordinary amount of effort to make sure that their neighbors can freely and fairly exercise their constitutional franchise of democratic self-governance. And we owe them a great deal, and we have a great deal to be proud of. We too get questions from time to time about something that happens in an election. We get a few hundred allegations of possible double voting. But because our clerks work very closely with each other and we communicate with each other, typically what happens is someone requests an absentee ballot. and they may forget about it or lose it in a pile of seed catalogs, and then they show up at the polls, and we were able to divine pretty quickly that in fact they only cast one ballot, and then the question is answered. But accountability is pretty important here, and I think that's the entire purpose of this commission, is to help bolster and instill confidence in the electoral process that belongs to the American people. And I hope that in those considerations, one of the things we focus on is what works well. What do we do right? And certainly, I listen very closely to the remarks of the president, but no one who's spoken, including the president, has questioned the legitimacy of the outcome of the 2016 election. And I think that's a great place to start from, is, what are the balance points between security and access? And I think that anything that we do to answer those questions, to reassure people that there are no goblins under the bed, and if there are, we deal with them in a way that is balanced, again, towards access of the voting public to participate in their government. This is not ours. It belongs to them. And I think as we move forward, the one thing that I want to focus on, and I tell our clerks this when we do our trainings every year, is that this is a process that does not belong to us. It belongs to the voters. And everything we do, we must do with devotion to assure that the voters have their voice heard, and that the ballots that are cast are done without question, and that the government that is installed to represent those people acts on their behalf with the confidence of the public. And I want to make sure that we answer those questions and that we move forward as a group with that same level of confidence. And I'll be very pleased to be a part of this. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for those very thoughtful words, without notes and with great brevity, I might add. With that, it'd be my privilege to recognize the longest-serving Secretary of State in American history, New Hampshire's Secretary of State, Bill Gardner. Secretary Gardner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman. I look forward to the work we have ahead. After our federal Constitution was ratified, a person asked George Washington this question: what is the most important thing that a person can do for his country? And Washington answered that in 5 words: express your views beyond yourself. When I first became aware of that, I took it to mean everyone's voice mattered. Be willing to share your views, have dialogue with others, and let others share their views with you, for it will strengthen our country. It can also be applied to voting, where we collectively express our views beyond ourselves by way of the ballot box. And the more often we get to do that, the more we fulfill the will of our first president. I would like more Americans to vote, not fewer. For over a half-century since the civil rights era of the 60s, our federal government and the states have been trying to find more and more ways to make it easier to vote. But when states try to balance that ease of voting with measures to increase voting integrity, it is often met with hostile resistance and charges of suppression. I will respect the facts that this commission receives, but it has been my belief over many years of administering elections that we will see an increase in voter turnout only when ease of voting is balanced with security and integrity. Making voting easier by itself does not result in higher turnout, as we have seen in our recent elections. Polls conducted just before the last presidential election found over half the country believes there's voter fraud, and polls after the election show a declining level of confidence in the balloting. During this century, there have been 3 national election commissions previous to this one. They spent time continuing the quest for ways to make voting easier. In my opinion, we need to first understand why turnout has not increased as a result. One of the previous commissions recommended states adopt photo ID requirements for voting, and that commission was severely criticized for doing so. We also need to compare states that have voter ID laws with those without. I might add that the two highest states in turnout during the presidential primaries last year were both photo ID states. Why is it important for the public to have confidence in their elections? The reason is contrary to common belief. One vote does matter. I have conducted nearly 500 recounts, all done by hand, counting paper ballots in a public process, including statewide, congressional, and various smaller district races. 11 of those recounts have ended in a tie. 32 were decided by one vote, and a total of 202 by less than 10 votes. And while serving as a state representative back in the 1970s, my state had a U.S. Senate race that was decided by 2 votes. The U.S. Senate, after that, tried to do a recount of that race and gave up after trying for 5 months. I am a witness that every vote matters, and there doesn't need to be massive voter fraud to sway the outcome. These are the experiences I will bring to this commission, and I will work with all of you, endeavoring to let the facts we receive speak for themselves. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for those words and for your long service to the people of your state. The chair now recognizes Judge Alan King of Jefferson County, Alabama, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Vice President and Secretary Kobach, it's a pleasure to serve on this committee. I appreciate the invitation. I'm Alan King. I'm the presiding probate judge in Jefferson County, Alabama. It's the largest county in the state of Alabama. We have roughly 660,000 residents, and in 2016, we had almost 460,000 registered voters. We have 2 probate judges in Jefferson County, and I was elected in 2000 as the place 2 probate judge, and then in 2006 and 12 as the presiding probate judge. I have a law degree, and I'm a former president of the Alabama Probate Judges Association. In Alabama, probate judges are the chief election official for his or her county. I've been involved in 10 major elections as the place 2 probate judge, and I've been the chief election official for 39 major elections as the presiding probate judge. On August 15 of this year, we will have a special election to fill the U.S. Senate seat vacated by now Attorney General Jeff Sessions. I have a certification through the Election Center, which is the premier, or one of the premier election training organizations in the United States. And so I'm involved in elections, have been involved in elections for 16 and a half years. I bring a wealth of experience from a county level. So to speak, I've had boots on the ground in every aspect of elections. I would consider myself to be an election expert on everything that involves elections. In the national organizations that I'm a member of, it's been my great pleasure to meet other election officials on the national level. I've talked extensively with men and women for the last few years. I feel inclined, since I'm the chief election official for Jefferson County, Alabama, to say that in my 16 and a half years in the Jefferson County probate judge position, that I have not seen evidence of voter fraud in Jefferson County. Had one situation, I think it was in 2014, where it was a father and a son had the same name. Became aware of that. I submitted this information to our district attorney, and the district attorney chose not to pursue any charges against either the father or the son. The executive order that created this commission refers to voter confidence and voter processes. And again, since I'm a county official, I feel inclined to say that that one of the most massive problems that will be facing this nation in the years to come is technology, and it's the technology of the voting machines. And I've seen it in the legal profession, from discovery and cases that come before me in court. I'm in court virtually all day, every day. And bottom line, technology is moving so fast that society is not able to keep up with the legal profession. My wife is a elementary school librarian, now called a school media specialist. She's not able, educators are not able to keep up with technology. And I would venture to say, Mr. Vice President, Secretary Kobach, that we have a huge challenge in this nation with keeping up with voting machine technology. And in 2002, the U.S. Congress in HAVA, Help America Vote Act, had funding that was filtered down to the states and to each county. And so from a county-wide standpoint, these voting machines are outdated. There's no money there. Counties don't have money. States don't have money. We need money. I was, thankfully, 4 years ago, I got on top of this issue. I was able to convince my county commissioners to fund the next generation of voting machines in Jefferson County. We did that in the 2016 election to the tune of $3.1 million. But not every county can do that. Not every state can do that. And as we go down this process, it is my hope that that will be an issue that we will discuss, because we can discuss a lot of things about voting, but unless we have the technology, unless the technology is keeping up with voting, then we're not using our time very wisely, in my opinion. So I hope that that's an issue that we will get into. I hope that's an issue that we will discuss and discuss freely, and I hope that's a recommendation that this commission makes to Vice President Pence, to you, and to President Trump. Again, thank you so very much for the opportunity to serve on this commission.
Well, thank you, Judge King. Thank you for bringing your extraordinary experience at the county level and those thoughtful opening remarks today. We look forward to working with you very much. Honored to have you here. With that, the chair recognizes Commissioner Christy McCormick, who is also a member of the Election Assistance Commission, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, Secretary Kobach, and my fellow distinguished commission members, I'm very much looking forward to participating in the mission of this commission. I started working in elections almost 30 years ago as an assistant voter registrar in East Haven, Connecticut. And since then, I've worked in several capacities in elections and voting, including 8 years in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division's voting section, litigating and defending our federal voting statutes, including the Voting Rights Act, the NVRA, UOCAVA, and the MOVE Act. I was detailed to Baghdad for a year as the Department of Justice's expert in elections to work on the Iraq national elections. And I have since served, since January 2015, as the Commissioner on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which is dedicated to making election administration better across our country. I've worked directly with state and local election officials from every state and territory, and I see my role on this commission as representing a wide range of election officials. I've also regularly interfaced with voting system vendors and not-for-profit voting and elections organizations, and I will always take their concerns and interests into consideration. Our Constitution provides that our states have the authority and responsibility to run our elections, and I fully support this provision. However, I also believe that our federal government does have an interest in elections being free, fair, and secure from outside and improper influences. Our nation as a whole should be dedicated to ensure the survival of America's representative democracy. Over the past year, and quite frankly much longer than that, we've heard that our election system is in danger. It is appropriate for us to examine any threats or dangers to our system, the integrity of our system, and the fairness of our system. We need to ensure that every American citizen who is eligible to vote may do so freely and privately, and that his or her vote is not diluted by improper votes or influence. We need to ensure that persons who are eligible to vote are not disenfranchised, and that voters have confidence that our system is producing accurate, secure, and expeditious results. With that in mind, I would like to see this commission, at a minimum, look at some of these questions. How we keep ineligible and those operating in bad faith off of and out of our voting systems. How we address the management of voter registration systems and the problem of inaccurate lists. I applaud the dedication and hard work of our election administrators across this country, and believe me, they have a hard, and extensively complex job. But I've also done election observation over the past dozen or so years, and I have yet to see a fully accurate voter list in any polling place across the country. I have seen firsthand irregularities take place in the polling place and in some offices. What causes a lack of voter participation and confidence in our system, and what actions should we consider that would hopefully boost participation and confidence and the voters' experience with our election system? What methods are currently used to identify, deter, and investigate improper registration and voting, and are those methods sufficient? And what are the methods currently used to identify, defer, and investigate voter intimidation or suppression, and are those methods working? The entire world looks to the United States as a model for representative democracy and free and fair elections. As a nation, we must continually review and investigate any possible issues with our voting system, and we must stay vigilant to protect our precious right to elect our leaders. I look forward to working with the Vice President and with other members of this commission. I expect, as I believe the other members of this commission do also, full transparency, courteous discussion, and professional respect. I appreciate, in spite of some of the media reports I've seen, that the commission has no preconceived results, that we are not afraid of the facts leading us to the truth, whatever that looks like, and that any conclusions or recommendations will be based on these truths. Finally, thank you to the President, Vice President, and for trusting me and allowing me to participate in this commission. It is an honor to serve my country. Thank you.
Well, Commissioner McCormick, thank you. Thank you for those good words. Thank you for bringing your vast experience in elections at home and abroad to this commission's work. We're grateful to have you. The chair now recognizes J. Christian Adams from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Vice Chairman Kobach. I'd also like to thank President Trump for initiating this long overdue effort. I would like to thank the other members of the commission for their willingness to examine the integrity of our electoral systems and to seek the truth about vulnerabilities in these systems and contemplate ways to improve the process. Most Americans value truth and value election systems deserving of our faith. It has been said that truth enlightens our intelligence and helps shape our freedom. Clean elections protect our freedom. Elections tainted by fraud disrupt the consent of the governed. I believe that all the commissioners are dedicated to an inquisitive and robust search for the data and for the truth about vulnerabilities in our elections and ways to improve the systems. There are areas of serious concern. For example, there are recurring indications that individuals are getting registered to vote even though they are marking the voter registration forms no to the question, are you a United States citizen? Again, they are checking the box on the registration form that they are not American citizens but are still getting registered to vote. What fair-minded American could support this? What serious, inquisitive American wouldn't ask, how does this happen? How often does this happen? How can we improve the system? Yet there are plenty of interests that would rather see these questions not be asked. The truth is more important, but these individuals do not want the questions asked, and that is the wrong approach. Americans have never assumed that we could not accomplish the mission, could not improve the way things work. There are ways to examine and reach the truth about our elections without harming a single legitimate voter registration. I'm sure the members of the commission will do their best, as I will, to improve our election system. For the first time, we have the tools, we have the will, and we have the support of the majority of the American people who are concerned with voter fraud to document these vulnerabilities in our systems and suggest improvements. And so I'm excited to help, and thank you for this effort.
Well, thank you, Mr. Adams. We're grateful to have you on the commission, and thank you for those opening remarks. The chair now recognizes the clerk of Wood County, West Virginia, Mark Rhodes, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for permitting me to be on this commission. It is an honor. As county clerk, yes, I am in charge of the elections, and several of the things that I've even heard discussed here, I can say it's happened to me. I started working in our IT department in Wood County in 1997. I believe if you check my voters registration record for the year 2000, you'll find that I voted a provisional ballot. And the reason being was I was deceased. We were doing before we had a statewide voter system, we had to do a data upload monthly to the Secretary of State's office. It wasn't working properly. I'd marked myself deceased, ran a test, never revived myself. I walked into the precinct. I went over to Janice, who was our poll worker. She said, "You're not in the book." I should be. I voted a provisional ballot because I was not in the book. I appeared at the county commission meeting during canvass, and they went, "Yep, you're alive," and my vote did count. So it's one of those, there are things that do happen. And we try to make sure that every legally cast ballot counts. In 2014, when I ran for my first election as county clerk, I won by 5 votes out of over 24,000 votes that were cast. So it's one of those, we need to have fair, clean, honest elections, and there should be no doubt that those 5 votes, my win is the win, and it's there. There should be no speculation. I just want to make sure that we have good, fair, clean, honest elections. And thank you for permitting me to serve.
Well, thank you, Clerk Rhodes. We're grateful to have you here bringing that experience, and I'm glad you're doing well. You look fine. Now the chair recognizes David Dunn of Arkansas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Secretary Kobach, I want to also thank President Trump for allowing me to serve. I'm humbled and I'm honored to have this opportunity to serve our country. Having grown up in the Delta into a political family and spent most of my life as an economic developer in one of the most economically depressed areas in our country, I know how important the democratic process is. Anything that calls into question the integrity of this process undermines the entire democratic system. We were asked today to present our thoughts on what we expected of this commission. I'm eager to learn, and I have today a bit, the priorities of my fellow commissioners, all of whom have met for the first time today. And I look forward to visiting with everyone on how to tackle these complex issues. My vision for this commission is threefold. First, it is my desire for us to look at a myriad of issues to determine whether there are significant problems involving election and voter integrity. We should look at the way the state's election systems are currently working and what resources or support they have and what might be needed to improve their accuracy and efficiency. Whether there's an increasing training of election and poll workers, improving communication between the states and localities across states, updating voter machines, or providing funds to assist localities in carrying out their voting and election work, I hope this commission will look at all the possibilities to help states in their efforts to run competent and true elections. Second, I hope that this commission will ensure the privacy of America's voting public. I understand while the letter that was sent to the states asked for only publicly available voter information, it still raised concerns. And I believe that any data, statistics, or information collected by us or by the state should be held in our trust and safeguarded from any political misuse. And finally, I hope that the activities of this bipartisan commission are completely transparent and public. It's important that our work be conducted with the highest level of integrity and that a variety of views can be expressed and considered. I applaud Vice President Pence for putting together this commission, and I look forward with each of you to ensure that the voters in my great state of Arkansas and across the country know that they will not be unlawfully disenfranchised and they can have confidence in the integrity of our election. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Dunn. Thank you for those very thoughtful words and admonitions. We value them and identify greatly with what you've said. Grateful to have you here. Lastly, let me let the chair recognize Hans von Spakovsky for 5 minutes.
Mr. Vice President, fellow members of the Commission, I want to thank President Trump for the honor of having appointed me to the Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. I come at this issue of election integrity from a very personal history. My German mother grew up in Nazi Germany as a child. My Russian father fought and escaped communism twice. They met in a displaced persons camp in Europe after the end of World War II before immigrating to the United States. My childhood was filled with stories of what it's like living in a dictatorship. And we were taught as children that the right to vote is a very precious right. It's one that can be easily lost, and that it was our duty to always vote and participate in the democratic process. I want to ensure that every American who is eligible is able to vote, and that his or her vote is not stolen or diluted because of administrative mistakes, errors by election officials, or intentional wrongdoing by those who are willing to take advantage of what we have, which is basically an honor system. I have almost 3 decades of experience in the field of voting and elections. That includes not only legal experience as a lawyer in the U.S. Department of Justice enforcing federal laws that protect the right to vote, but I've also been a local county election official in 2 states, Georgia and Virginia. So I know very well how hard election officials work to try to administer the voting process fairly. But we do have problems that need to be fixed. We have vulnerabilities in the administrative system that we have, and we also have a history of voter fraud in this country. The Supreme Court itself said in 2008, when it upheld Indiana's voter ID law, the U.S. has a long history of voter fraud and that could make the difference in a close election. And we have many close elections in this country. Now, one of the documents I'm going to hand out to everyone on the commission, and this is a printout, and it's easily available on the Heritage website, is a database that we started about 2 years ago of voter fraud cases from around the country. We are up to almost 1,100 proven cases of voter fraud, including almost 1,000 convictions of individuals in court. These cases run the gamut and show all the ways that voter fraud is committed in this country. It includes impersonation fraud at the polls, false voter registrations, duplicate voting, fraudulent absentee ballots, vote buying, ineligible voting by felons and non-citizens, altering of vote counts, and ballot petition fraud. We know we have problems with the accuracy of our voter registration lists. Numerous studies have been done about this that show, including the Interstate Crosscheck Program, that we have literally hundreds of thousands of voters who are registered in multiple states, and we have many people who are deceased remaining on the voter rolls. No systematic, all-encompassing study has been done about these problems. But we know that more must be done to improve the accuracy of our voter registration system and the security of our voting process. Now, I have full confidence in this commission, which is a bipartisan commission, and I look forward to working with my colleagues. But I can't end my remarks without addressing what I consider to be the unfair, unjust, and unwarranted criticisms that have been leveled at this commission and some of its members. My father passed on to me the belief that one of the best things about America is the ability to have spirited but civil debates, even on contentious issues. Yet we seem to have lost that valuable part of our democratic process. Members of this commission, including me, have already been subjected to vicious and defamatory personal attacks. Those who want to ensure the integrity of the election process are only interested in preserving our great democracy. The scurrilous charges that have been made are reprehensible and a tactic, frankly, to avoid a substantive debate on important issues and to prevent the research, inquiry, and study that is necessary to identify the problems in our election process, to determine what the solutions are, and to therefore ensure that we have the best election and best democratic system in the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Commissioner von Spakovsky. Thank you for bringing your practical experience and your background to this commission. We're truly grateful, and grateful for your stirring words. Well, let me say, listening to all of the commissioners on this panel, I am more confident than ever that this bipartisan group is going to perform an enormously valuable nonpartisan service to the American people. I'm grateful for the words of admonition and challenge one to another. I can attest and promise you that we do go into this process with no preconceived notions or preordained results. And the President has charged us to pursue the facts, and we will follow them with integrity where they lead. This will be a transparent and open process. But knowing the background of all these commissioners, I can also promise you a spirited but also civil debate. And we look very much forward to that. Our charge is simple. In the executive order establishing this commission, let me reiterate, it's to help to promote free and honest federal elections, to study registration and voting processes used in federal elections, to identify vulnerabilities to the process that could lead to improper voter registration or even improper voting. We will live up to that, and we will challenge one another to achieve that. And I know in my heart that we'll do a great service to the American people. With that, the chair would like to recess the meeting for a short lunch break. Vice Chair Kobach will reconvene in approximately 20 minutes to preside over the rest of the meeting's agenda. But on behalf of the President and myself, I offer you my heartfelt thanks for being willing to serve your country at such a time as this in this important work. So thank you much, and we're in recess.
All right, I'll call the meeting back to order. We are now continuing with item number 4 on our agenda, and I'll walk us through that. The first part is just a reiteration of the mission that is laid out in the executive order of May 11th, 2017. It's Executive Order 13799. Members of the commission should have a copy, and of course it is available on the White House website. I'll just read it. Section 3 of the executive order states, mission: the commission shall, consistent with applicable law, study the registration and voting processes used in federal elections. The commission shall be solely advisory and shall submit a report to the President that identifies the following. A, those laws, rules, policies, activities, strategies, and practices that enhance the American people's confidence in the integrity of the voting processes used in federal elections. B, those laws, rules, policies, activities, strategies, and practices that undermine the American people's confidence in the integrity of the voting processes used in federal elections. And C, those vulnerabilities in voting systems and practices used in federal elections that could lead to improper voter registrations and improper voting, including fraudulent voter registrations and fraudulent voting. Are there any comments on the mission? And if not, we will proceed to the next item on the agenda. All right, seeing none, we'll move to the bylaws and operating procedures. So at this point, we have not formally adopted any bylaws yet, and that's our next order of business. There is presented to the commission a proposal for the bylaws of this Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. The proposal is pretty closely mirrors the bylaws that were provided by the GSA. Right. So the GSA has a sort of prototype of bylaws that, as many people may know, there are approximately 1,000 commissions at any given time. Many of them are ongoing. Presidential commissions are more rare. They only represent about 4% of that 1,000. But they all have bylaws, and so we started with the model and have staff has suggested minimal changes to them, but this is the proposed bylaws. These are the proposed bylaws, and at this point, I'm hoping that members of the commission have already had a chance to look at these bylaws, and the next point to be appropriate would be a motion to adopt, if there is one, and then we can discuss.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Second.
And there's a motion and a second, and actually one of the items in the bylaws is that we don't require a second, but at this point, we haven't adopted them yet, so. Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Adams moved and seconded respectively. All right, so now the issue is before the commission. Is there any discussion of these bylaws? All right, they seem pretty straightforward to me as well. Is there a move to call it, well, since there's no discussion, I guess we can go ahead and call the question then. All right, so the question is called. All those in favor of adopting these bylaws, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. All right, the bylaws have been adopted unanimously. The next topic is a forward-looking question, and that is what topics might the commission wish to address at future meetings? I took the liberty of just putting together some ideas on paper, just as a starting point. And that's really all this is, just to get the discussion moving here. And I will pass these out to people, and I'll read them into the record. And again, this is nothing more than my thoughts on the topic, and would invite any additions or deletions, or we can scrap this entirely. But just laying out the topic for the commission to think about. I wrote down 5 possible ways to divide the subject matter. One would be accuracy of voter rolls, including people who have moved from one state to another, non-citizens who may have gotten on the voter rolls one way or another, deceased individuals who remain on the voter rolls, and felons who are disqualified according to the laws of that state, which of course vary from state to state. And then within that topic, strategies to increase accuracy, obstacles to increasing accuracy. Second topic, fraudulent or improper voting, the scope of the problem and strategies to address the problem. The idea being that would be, there's so many different ways of dividing up this issue. You know, there's activities that occur on voting day. There are activities that might occur in a early voting stage where a state has voting by mail. And then there's activities involving the registration process, which may be well before any voting even occurs. Then the third general topic was voting by mail, and that encompasses a wide variety of subtopics, issues involving threats to the integrity of voting by mail. We have a hybrid system in our state where and indeed most states have this now, where you have voting on election day, and then you also have a period of voting by mail preceding the election day. But we now have several states that, of course, have gone to all mail balloting too. So that could all be wrapped into that topic. Fourth topic I just thought of as one that we may potentially want to address, but we certainly don't have to, and that's cybersecurity regarding state voter databases. All of the state and county officials here have access to these databases, and each state takes steps to protect them against efforts to hack or to break in to the voter registration databases. That's one topic we may wish to tackle. Fifth topic, voter intimidation and consequences of state efforts to increase election integrity. And then 6, any additional topics people want to discuss. So with that, just sort of a thought paper to get people started, I'd entertain any discussion.
One of the more profound points that come out of the collective sharing of opening statements was the importance of one single vote. We have 3,140 counties or the equivalent where voting is executed. It would be interesting to catalog across the country how many initiatives, whether they be for hospital levies, school levies, candidate elections, are determined by one ballot. Now, the reason I say that is because, you know, when we look at the big numbers like 5 million, 6 million, 7 million, you know, it is easy for somebody to summarily dismiss it. But when we drive home the importance of every single legal vote cast and the integrity of the ballot box, we can show people the consequence of one illegal diluting ballot, a ballot that dilutes a legal ballot. Now, my understanding is that there are some states that can readily get us those numbers, and we don't necessarily have to go back to the, you know, the first recording of a state's history. We can take a period of time over the last 2 cycles, or, you know, just to get us a snapshot so that we can help drive home the point to the American voter that their single ballot counts. This is what this is about. You know, the voter's ballot and vote is the voter's voice. And we want to make sure that no voices are being illegally, negated.
I might just mention real quickly, in response to that, I'll take the chair's prerogative. We actually tried that in Kansas for the purposes of a legislative hearing on a bill that was in front of the legislature to see how many elections were decided by a very small number of votes. And it was amazing how there wasn't a central repository in our state of that. And the county election officer for our largest state, Johnson County, came to the commission and said over a 10-year period, here's what we have. And I was astonished by the number of elections that had been decided by fewer than 10 votes or were dead ties or were one vote. But he had to do extensive research looking back through his data, which was not easily available in a place where you could just know where to go to online. So I personally think that would be fascinating information to have, but I imagine it might be harder to obtain than we think.
And Mr. Chairman, we probably, again, can't get every jurisdiction based on personnel, time, money, but I think we can get a representative group to drive home that point. And again, as the Vice President said, one person, one vote. That is the bedrock upon which our democracy is based. And a lot of decisions are made by 1, 2, 3 ballots, votes.
Mr. King?
Yeah, Mr. Vice Chair, really until I was contacted about potentially serving on this commission and read certain things in the media, gosh, I don't know where, I just assumed that someone could only be registered in one state. I just thought that was the law of different states, quite frankly. And to find out that people are registered, we'll say state A, and then they have a vacation home in state B, that they can be registered in both states and potentially vote an absentee in one state, we'll say, and go to their resort state and vote another ballot. I don't know if that happens or not, but it seems like to me that I'd like for us to discuss a recommendation to the president that someone can only be registered in one state. And, if someone has a vacation home, great, but vote an absentee ballot or early voting or whatever the state allows in that state, that should be sufficient. I don't see where anyone needs to be registered in two or more states, quite frankly. I would like for us to discuss that.
And I can certainly add something there too. The interstate cross-check system, which all the states represented here are participants in, and Kansas hosts, goes to that very issue. And it's very easy to get registered in your new state when you move, but unfortunately it's harder than one might think to deregister the person, because that's usually the last thing they think of when they're moving is, oh, I better call the county I used to live in and send them a written piece of paper saying that I no longer live there and I'm no longer wishing to vote there. So it's an extraordinarily big problem, and I certainly think it is worthy of discussion. Mr. Stokowski.
Two things. One on Secretary Blackwell's recommendation that we try to get as many of the states as possible to provide us information on elections in the recent years, perhaps the last 10 years, that have been decided by a very small number of votes. I think that is a good idea. Part of what we're supposed to be doing is gathering data. And a great example of this that I'm sure the secretaries know is that Secretary Husted, I think of Ohio, just a couple of years ago, put out press releases in which he had done that. He had gone through and found numerous, particularly local elections in Ohio that had been decided by one vote or by ties. So that information is out there. On the second issue that Judge King raised, that is a very important issue. We know from the various studies that have been done, including the Pew study, that there are a lot of people who are registered in more than one state. Now, many of those are probably errors. Someone moved, they didn't notify the prior state. And part of what this commission, I think, has to do is try to come up with recommendations that will help states improve the communications between the states so they can find these individuals. But what prior studies have not done is taken the second step Yes, they've looked at voter registration lists and found individuals registered in multiple states. What we don't know is how many of those are errors, simple administrative errors, innocent errors, and how many of those are individuals who are taking advantage of that to illegally vote in more than one state. And the second half of that kind of a study, which others have really not done, is getting also the voting histories to check that. And the database that we have has examples of individuals who were prosecuted for voting in more than one state. And that certainly is a problem. We need to look at how big of a problem that is and what can be done to prevent it.
And I would just add, not that I'm going to comment on every comment here, but the cross-check database sends to the participating states what are possible cases of double voting. We say possible because every match is always a potential false positive, so further investigation is always warranted. But in the last 2 years, my state has obtained guilty convictions on 8 cases of double voting. In many of those, serial double voters who voted in 2 states, election after election after election. So it's not complicated to obtain that information. The only part is that everything is with the caveat that there has to be further investigation to make sure it's not a false positive. But, Christie.
Yeah, I actually have potentially 2 or 3 additional topics. Maybe they fit in elsewhere. And of course, there probably will be more topics that these spread to as we start our work. But I think we should look pursuant to the presidential executive order, the causes for the lack of voter participation and confidence in our elections. And I'm not sure how we collect that data, or we can get some witness testimony on that. But we do have a very low participation rate amongst democracies in the world, and I would like to know why. And then also, I think we should look at automatic voter registration. A number of states are taking up automatic voter registration. Several have already passed it and have put it into place. But I think that raises some questions about the accuracy of the voting rolls, how this is all playing out, and how it will change the voter registration processes across the country. And then I think what I'd like to also look at, and I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but how voter crimes are identified and investigated for prosecution in this country. I think that resources are scarce, and so these prosecutions often are not followed up on because of the dockets of our prosecutors. I could be wrong about that, but I'd like to find that out. I also, just from my own experience, know that it's very hard to identify voter fraud when it's happening, especially impersonation voting, which we've heard many claims of is a myth. I know from personal experience and seeing it in person myself that it is not a myth. But I think we should look at how we identify and deter and prosecute voter crimes in the country.
Secretary Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On your list, you have cybersecurity regarding state voter databases listed. And when I originally thought about the purpose of the commission, I thought, well, we probably shouldn't go there. There's so many other people looking at this. But I think it might be helpful if we did look at the overall cybersecurity issue and just determine how communication to the chief election officials should occur, and the timing of that, and just the cooperation of the EAC, the DHS. You know, I have an opportunity this month yet to visit the MS-ISAC in Albany, New York. And so I think we're all learning more and more about it, but I don't think it would be harmful if we put some of that information that we're gaining in one spot, so we could maybe suggest some best practices regarding information sharing and security levels, those kinds of things.
I might just chime in on that point, Secretary Lawson. The one hesitation I had, and didn't really have hesitation, but one hesitation I have in thinking about the cybersecurity topic is some of the fellow secretaries of state here may have had briefings in your respective states that are either sensitive or classified, and the briefing will be about were there any attempts to breach the state's registration rules, and so some of the discussions are themselves sensitive. For example, if the commission were to say, well, we have an expert in public testimony say, well, here are the things the states are doing well, but if you want to break into a state's voter rolls, here are the weaknesses. Well, which is exactly what those sensitive discussions are about. Then we, in a way, have sort of given a roadmap to those who might wish to breach the state's secure voter rolls. So my concern on that topic is that we might have to go into a closed session for part of the meeting, but maybe that shouldn't deter us. That may just be what we have to do.
And it's my understanding, and I guess this can be verified, is that there is another presidential commission looking at cyber vulnerabilities across the board. I think it's being chaired by Mayor Rudy Giuliani. There are times when we can be read into certain conversations, whether they be, confidential meetings, and I think we ought to explore it. The reality is that while some of us have had top secret clearance before, as commissioners, we don't have top secret clearance. But there are people who are concerned about various threats that would fall under the umbrella of information that is confidential. So I think we need to explore administratively ways that we can be read into pertinent aspects of our exploration. And we also have to be willing to understand that sometimes we won't be able to go into that lane, with our examination.
Mr. McCormick.
Yes, obviously, as my job as a commissioner in the Election Assistance Commission, we are looking into a lot of these issues, and we're working with the Department of Homeland Security. But I do believe that there's a role for us to play here, in that if, maybe not to the detail where we have to, reveal methodologies and things of that nature, but look at the realities of how feasible it is for someone, a bad actor, to get into our voter registration systems and possibly manipulate voter information. I know we've heard the stories of 21 states, and in some cases 39 states in the press being somewhat hacked. The Department of Homeland Security can't define hack. They said they'd have to give us 21 different definitions of that. But I think that it is worthwhile for us to look at whether voter information can be manipulated if our systems are penetrated. And hopefully we wouldn't have to get into deep security issues with that, but I certainly think, at least on the surface, it's worth exploring.
Chris, Mr. Chairman, and you're right, Commissioner McCormick. 2015, the Federal Office of Personnel Management was hacked, and 25 million employees had exposure to potential breach of personal information. So we have to operate in the real world. There are real threats and real vulnerabilities, and we can't be limited in terms of what's being done to protect the American people, whether it's their Social Security numbers, their financial situation, or the integrity of their ballot. We have to understand that there are real threats to the integrity of the ballot box, and to the degree that we can work cooperatively with other commissions and authorities, Homeland Security, and get a beat on this, I think we have to press to see just how far we can go, because it's important to our work.
Yes, Secretary Lawson.
I also think that there's some positive statements that could come out of this, and that is that our election system is decentralized. Our voting equipment is not not online. Our tabulation machines are not connected to the internet. So I think there's some positive statements that we could make that would ensure the public that our systems are not as vulnerable as what may have been suggested in the past.
Judge King?
In my opening statement, I, of course, made reference to funding for upgrades for counties and states for voting machines. And here's the reality of this. I've been there on election night. I've been there during election day when machines aren't working properly. and you have to bring in other machines. And thankfully, Jefferson County, we're a fairly large county, and we've got the financial resources to, and we've got excess machines, but there's a lot of counties in this nation who don't have the resources. And it's all, and we can talk about elections a lot, but if people can't vote because the machines don't work, then we've got a massive, massive problem. And we've got to address that. We've got, in my opinion, we've got to address funding in a recommendation by the president to Congress. Let's do another funding like we did for HAVA in 2002. And states, counties all across this nation use that money to purchase voting machines. So here, what we've got now is we've got 13 and 15-year-old voting machines, and you've got voting machines that don't work. You've got, these machines need parts, and we've got these counties and states, we've got to have the funds. Otherwise, you know, we're missing the big picture if we don't make sure that we have the machines that are state-of-the-art and that work and work properly.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. I've been paying close attention to what's being said, and it's a fascinating discussion, and I think, you know, because I know best what we do in Maine. And, you know, some of the discussion around what Commissioner King just referred to with the voting machine breakdowns, we don't have voting machines in Maine. We use you know, optical scan tabulators. But it's happened a couple times that a tabulator breaks down. And because, you know, we are a paper ballot state, you know, our town clerks always have the option of hauling out the old wooden ballot box and have people cast them into the ballot box until such time as a technician can fix that machine and get the optical scan tabulation. One of the things that comes to my mind is this issue of chain of custody, you know, and the discussion around fraudulent activity or the illegal activity. And that boils down to the overt act of committing a crime. And that's a little bit tougher to discern, you know, and in my prior life in public service, I spent 6 years as chair of our Fish and Wildlife Committee. And one of the discussions that came from our Supreme Court was how you define the illegal activity. And of course, it's been illegal since 1914 in Maine to jack deer at night. But you can have, pursuant to the Supreme Court, you can have a firearm in the woods where deer jumping all around you. You can have ammunition, you can have a light, and you can be there at 3 in the morning. It's not until you shine the tree line or fire the shot that you've committed a crime. And, you know, when we had a disputed election just a few years ago in a Senate district, over 25,000 ballots cast, and there was a 7-vote margin, and there's a recount, and I showed up at the recount just as it got started, and my intrepid deputy, Julie Flynn, who's many of you know her from around the country, she goes to a lot of your states and is an expert on these issues. I walked in and she said this one town, the town of Long Island, had made a mistake, and they missed counting 21 ballots. Well, when we all were said and done, the margin had flipped by 14 votes. Those 21 ballots made a difference. And the challenger, who apparently had started to win the election and now was losing the election, I was at the grocery store, calls me up, the lawyer calls me up and said, we just want to maybe put this whole thing to bed. We want to check the incoming voter list, which matches up the number of people that voted versus the number of ballots cast. No problem. We get in there on Monday morning, and wouldn't you know, those 21 ballots were not accounted for. And that changed the dynamic very quickly. Because I can describe with some authority the chain of custody of a ballot from the time it leaves a printing press to when it's sealed in a ballot box. And while we identified that pretty articulately, it's like, where did these 21 ballots come from? And it raised a lot of suspicion. You could cut the air with a knife, and went to a special Senate committee. And when they recounted the ballots, we discovered that in the recount, which is manned by a Republican and a Democrat and supervised by one of our staff, they had inadvertently left those 21 ballots from a prior lot on the table and mixed them with another lot and inadvertently counted them twice. So there was no fraud. You know, and Julie and I would talk on the phone at night. It's like, how could this have happened? Could a ballot clerk have marked ballots and then got cold feet and stuffed them in a ballot box so nobody be the wiser? And then the recount hit. So part of, you know, I think what we can maybe ask of folks is how their chains of custody work to help maybe allay some of these fears that something may have gone wrong in an election. If you have an accountability standard where you can trace back, you can't ever tell how someone voted, but you know who showed up, you know how many ballots were issued. And of course, that's a little bit easier for a paper ballot state like the state of Maine, but I think it's a question worth asking, because I think it helps answer some of these questions and allays some of the fears.
Mr. Bukowski.
Mr. Vice Chairman, we've been talking about general principles. Would this be an appropriate time to talk about other data that I think we need to get?
Sure. Really, we're just kind of mapping out places the commission may go, so to speak, in its inquiry.
We have very appropriately asked for voter registration and voter history from the states. But I think part of the inquiry into deciding, how accurate are the voter rolls and what can be done to improve them, is to also inquire to the states what databases do they actually consult when they are verifying the accuracy of voter registration information. And for example, in counties, in county governments, are they accessing, for example, county tax records? The reason for doing that is, of course, because it's illegal to register to vote at a commercial address. You're supposed to register to vote at a residence address, and by consulting tax records, county governments can quickly tell if someone is illegally registering at a commercial address. Are they accessing other databases, Department of Vital Records, Corrections Department, DMV records? Then we need an inquiry, those are all state records. Are they consulting federal databases? For example, are they doing data comparisons with the Social Security Master Index of death records? And not just are they doing it, but how often are they doing it? Because if they're only doing it once every 5 years, that's obviously inadequate. If they're doing it on a more frequent basis, then it may be adequate. There are also other databases that I know many states are not consulting, and even those that are have run into huge problems of red tape. And by that I mean, for example, the databases at the Department of Homeland Security that have information on all non-citizens who are legally in the United States and information on all individuals who are illegally in the United States who have been detained and a record has been created. That's obviously an important issue to know whether, one, they are accessing those databases and whether they're able to do it easily or whether they're running into red tape with the federal government. We also, I think, need to gather data from other sources to see what other information is out there that could help states. And I'll give you several examples of what I mean. For example, more than a decade ago, the Government Accountability Office did a report in which they looked at what other kind of information is available that could help election officials with their voter registration lists. They checked with several federal district courts across the country. In one particular federal district court, they were told that in a 2-year period, a certain percentage of the individuals called for jury duty had been excused for being non-citizens. Now, the federal court clerks get their jury lists from the local state voter registration list. We need to get that data, I think, from all of the federal district courts around the country, because that'll give us an idea of how many potential non-citizens are being called for jury duty for federal courts who've been taken from the voter registration list. We also need to find out, because I think the answer is no, they do not do that. Do the federal court clerks, when someone is excused from jury duty because they're not a U.S. citizen, do they then send that information back to election officials, state and local, so the election officials can investigate this and see whether this is someone who needs to be taken off the roll? Second, do they forward that information to the U.S. attorney in that district, because it is a felony under federal law for a non-citizen to register or vote? My understanding is that they are not doing that. We also need to find out from the U.S. attorney's offices all across the country whether they are complying with a provision in the National Voter Registration Act which requires U.S. attorneys to send information about felony convictions obtained in federal court to state election officials, so that those state election officials in states that take away the right to vote, whether you've been convicted of a felony conviction, whether they have that information available. My understanding is that many of the U.S. district courts, many of the U.S. attorneys' offices across the country pay no attention to this federal requirement. There is also information in the Department of Homeland Security's files on individuals who apply for citizenship. One of the questions on the application form for naturalization is a question that specifically asks, have you registered or voted in elections? We need to know from DHS, we need data on those files. How many files do they have of individuals, non-citizens, who answered yes to that question? What do they do with that information? My understanding is that they do not forward that information to the U.S. Justice Department for investigation and possible prosecution. There's all these sources of federal data there that nothing is being done about, that's not being sent to election officials, and that is not being forwarded to the U.S. Justice Department for investigation and possible prosecution. And those are all sources of data that I think this commission needs to make inquiries about.
I might just comment on that. As many of the commissioners know, the Department of Justice coincidentally sent a letter to the states within the last month or so asking about efforts to keep maintain the voter rolls and keep them accurate. And that the responses from the states may include some of the information you just requested about what efforts states are making to verify the accuracy of their voter rolls. And with respect to non-citizens who on a jury form, a juror request form or summons, state, I'm not a U.S. citizen, therefore I cannot participate in this jury, I'm almost certain that the federal courts are not sending that information about this person who's on your voter rolls says he cannot participate because he's a non-citizen. I know that even in the state judiciary, I can state my experience in Kansas, we looked at that, and our state courts have a similar form. You can decline jury duty if you're not a U.S. citizen. And the state courts weren't even providing that to the Secretary of State's office or to the county clerks who maintain our voter rolls at the county level. And so we had to pass a special law just to order the courts to periodically give us that information so we could compare it. And that's how we discovered some of the 128 non-citizens who are registered in Kansas that we know of specifically, was through that. But we weren't getting it until we asked for it and then finally had to pass a statute to get it. And I'm certain that we're not getting it yet from the federal courts. So, you mentioned that there are several federal databases and there might be some information already in the hands of the federal government. And if there's no objection from the commission, I think that might be one task we can delegate to staff is to, in the interim between now and the next meeting is start trying to collect whatever data there is that's already in the possession of the federal government that might be helpful to us. Yes, Secretary Lawson.
I just would like to point out that since 2012, the National Association of Secretaries of State has had a resolution asking the federal government for assistance in providing the data that they have so that we could keep our list more up to date. And in fact, that was readopted the 10th of July, 2017. So the National Association is aware of that and would appreciate any information that we could get from the federal government to help us keep our list clean.
And I personally see this commission as a valuable opportunity to hopefully make a reality what NAS has been asking for many years. Bipartisan desire, please federal government, you have information that will help us keep our voter rolls clean. Could we possibly use that information or could you make it available to us in some form? And more often than not, over my experience as Secretary of State, the answer has been either silence, we're not going to answer your request, or if we answer your request, it's going to be not really. You might get a sliver of information, but not any information that would be really helpful. So I'm hopeful that this commission can A, look at some of the information that the federal government already possesses, and B, perhaps recommend protocols after this commission is disbanded, going forward about how the federal government can be a helpful partner in keeping our elections secure and our voter rolls clean and up to date.
Mr. Vice Chairman, we have at least one state in the country that has no voter registration. And I would think it would be very interesting to hear from that state how they run their elections. How do they handle no registration? We also have a number of states and growing number of states who are going to online voter registration. I think it would be interesting to look at that as well and to see the impact of online voter registration and how that has changed the registration environment across the country as well.
And I assume you're referring to North Dakota?
Yes, North Dakota.
Well, in Wood County, we've increased almost 4,000 voters over the past year that we've been doing online and DMV. It's an opt-out currently. If you go to DMV and register your driver's license, you have to opt out if you don't want to register to vote. In July of 19, it's going to be, it's an opt-in. In July of 19, they're going to switch it to an opt-out. So if you don't make a choice, or you don't say, no, I don't want to register to vote, it automatically registers you to vote. So we've increased our voters' rolls, as I said, probably about 4,000 over the past year, mainly because of the DMV.
Mr. Vice Chairman?
Yes.
Has that actually increased voter participation and turnout?
No. No.
So I think that's something worth looking at.
I do think it's beneficial because 3 years ago, when I went to the high schools, both the two major high schools in Wood County have about 400 graduating class. I registered roughly 100 students to vote before the election cycle. We did it a couple months ago. We registered 2 students. Is because everybody that we're getting through the DMV is a 1999 date of birth. So as they're going to get their driver's license, they're going ahead and registering to vote. So, yeah. Is that going to increase voter turnout in the future? I don't know. But it's one of those, we have to verify every address. We figured out that the automatic data comparison is not always correct. So we have got people that changed names because they got married. They were still registered to vote under their old one, but they said they wanted to register to vote under their new name. So only by doing cross-checks have we been able to determine that they were actually duplicate voters within the system. So those are things that we just, in-house, we have to figure out the best way to handle to make sure we don't have duplicates.
Secretary Gardner?
I think that we would really accomplish a lot if we could come to terms with why, for 40 years, states and the federal government have been doing all these things to try to make it easier for people to vote, and it hasn't happened. And when NVRA, when that passed, people did predict that it was not going to have anything to do with the turnout. But those promoting it said, oh no, this is once we get people on the list, they're going to come out and vote, they're going to come out and vote. Well, what happened 6 years later in Florida was directly because of what the federal government did with NVRA. Because people were showing up at the polls and were being sent home because they weren't on the list. They said, but we registered. Well, where'd you register? Well, I registered at Disney World. Or some group came and said they would put it in the mail. And so all of that problem that we saw in Florida, you put aside the punch card machines, but people showing up to vote, was the result of that federal law that opened the process of registration. And it didn't get more people to vote. Automatic voter registration is not going to get more people to vote. It is the will of the voter. It is the value that the voter sees in actually doing it. That is the key to getting more people to vote. So after we had NVRA, we ended up with Help America Vote Act. The federal government gives the states $2.9 billion. I've had reports that over half of that money spent on types of voting equipment has already been destroyed, thrown away. Because as you, Judge King, have said, these voting machines that are 10 or 12 years old are now antiquated. Well, I can bring you to a polling place in my state that has a voting machine that was patented in 1890, and they are still using that voting machine. So at the time that Help America Vote Act passed, a lot of states decided to spend the money, spend millions and millions of dollars on state-of-the-art voting equipment without thinking about, is it possible that this voting equipment, state-of-the-art, in 5 years, or in 10 years, or in 12 years, could be worthless? And are we going to keep doing that every 10 or 12 years because equipment is worthless? And you look at the number of states that have done that and then have actually gone back to paper, like Maryland did about a year ago. Went back to paper, the old way. So the biggest contribution I think that we could make is if we could answer that question in some way of what is the will to vote. And it's, the equation has been upside down on the seesaw, all about ease, all about ease. But there are professors now across this country, more and more of them, that are talking about how important the confidence is in a person, that a person has, a potential voter has in the process. And is that the key that will get us to the will? Because if something is of value, you know that we are all going to go out of our way to get it or to take advantage of it, if it's of value to us. And it's the same thing with the voting process. It's what is that value? Now, and professors have told me this, that voting is fragile anyway, because so many in this country see their vote as really nothing. Because there's millions, several of us have talked about this, there's millions and millions of votes, so our votes are nothing. But as Commissioner Blackwell has said, we break that down to the local level. And there are elections all the time that are being decided. As I mentioned, I've actually had 11 recounts that ended in a tie. And these were thousands and thousands of votes. So I would really like to look at, if, as we know, the polls have shown, I saw the Gallup poll the week before the presidential election, 55% have said there's voter fraud. Why are so many people in the country actually saying that? Then there was a second poll. And for the first time, going back 6, 8 presidential elections, after the election, there's a study that I've seen within the last month that when people are asked afterwards, after the presidential election, going back that many of them, do you feel your vote was counted accurately? Do you feel that the process itself was secure and had integrity? And this is the first presidential election that the number has gone below 50%. This one in 2016. So that is what we're looking at. And unfortunately, in your state, you've got 12-year-old machines that just aren't working anymore. If you look back to those who were promoting states do exactly what your state did back in 2004 and in 2005, and understand who they were and why they were doing it, that would go a long way in preventing this same thing from happening every 12 years, because we don't have hundreds of millions of dollars to be spent every decade.
On that subject, is there any objection to staff? We've had several comments on this issue of close elections and at least trying to compile some information. Is there any objection to staff making some efforts to obtain that information, either to the extent that it already exists online or, if necessary, to make requests to states? Is there any objection to that? Okay. Commissioner Blackwell.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Gardner just underscored a point that I was making in my opening remarks and in the Yale Law and Policy Review. Some of it is not within the purview of this commission, but you know, we know and we defend and we advance the right to vote, but we don't talk enough about the duty to vote. And if you take a look at what's happening in our school systems across the country, there is less and less attention being given to civics and citizenship. And as a consequence, people are losing, in a free society, the encouragement to exercise the duty to vote and to deal with any reasonable requirement to make sure that legally cast votes are not diluted. I'm the chairman of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. We get most of our funding from USAID and other allied countries. And we conduct elections across the globe. Kenya is coming up in August, Liberia in October. And we, in fact, strongly advocate voter ID. We were in the forefront of advocating for, you know, the purple fingers. And then we find that there is resistance to this, you know, practical application as experienced in New Hampshire, to securing some way of making sure voters are who they say they are, and making sure that IDs are accessible in terms of cost, so that it's not burdensome and consistent with other things within our culture, whether it's taking out a library book, whether it's getting on an airplane, you know, you name it. You know, we are accustomed buying cigarettes. We are accustomed in this country to having to show that we are who we purport to be. And so I think part of the resistance to this is that we've lost this balance between the right to have access, reasonable, you know, to the ballot box, and our duty to make sure that we take on any reasonable burden of protecting the integrity of the ballot box. And that's one of the things that we can do as a commission is to underscore the importance of that balance.
Yes, Judge King?
Yeah, to respond, you know, since I've been in office, we have a great vendor. I'm very well pleased with our vendor. I think it's a great product. We've gone from memory cards, now we go to thumb drives. But the reality is, elections are complex. And for anyone, and everyone on this commission's been involved in elections, but you know, I don't think the general population understands the advanced work that goes into an election, and then election day, and then after the election. These are enormous jobs, and these are very complex. And but we can't just turn our back on the fact that technology is here. Technology is coming. Technology will continue to rule our elections. And for large metropolitan areas, and you know, whether you're in New York City or Detroit or Minneapolis or Birmingham, if you know, unless Ms. McCormick with the EAC tells, you know, passes all these rules that voting machine companies have to have standards where their voting machines will last for the next decade or 15 years or 20 years or whatever. We don't need new voting machines. That's just the reality. And otherwise, we're going to be sitting here for a Tuesday election, and it'll still be going on into Thursday. We have to have, and whether it's millions of dollars or whatever, in my opinion, we have to have this money. Counties and states have to have this money. That's just a reality. Whether it's a car, whether it's a voting machine, things are going to go wrong. You need money to fix them. And we just can't turn our back and pretend that technology isn't here, that we're not going to need a lot of money, states and counties, in the years and decades to come.
Commissioner
I'd just
Von
like to make two suggestions to deal with collecting the data on what Judge King and Secretary Gardner are expressing concern over, which I certainly share. One, I think it would behoove the commission to ask the states to provide us data on what kind of voting equipment they use in the state and what the lifetime, predicted lifetime is of that equipment and how far along they are in it. That'll give us an idea, I think, of what the needs of the states are going to be in that area. Second, I would recommend that the staff collect for the members of the commission data from the U.S. Census Bureau. The U.S. Census Bureau does surveys after federal elections of individuals who did not vote and did not register to vote. And the surveys go into very extensive detail of trying to find out why did they not register and why didn't they vote. That data is very, very useful for answering the question that Secretary Gardner raised, because the possible answers that are given are everything from, problems registering to the biggest reason I think people give are that they're just not interested in elections or they're not interested in the candidates. But the point is, I think we ought to get those census surveys for the commissioners, because I think it'll provide you very useful information on that particular issue.
Secretary Dunlap.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. I would like to sort of add my voice to the discussion around things like automatic voter registration, something we discussed in the state of Maine unsuccessfully this legislative session. I'm one of those, I reside in one of those civilized states that the Secretary of State has jurisdiction over the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. And, and as we talk about things like voter ID and automatic voter registration, we've talked a great deal about that triangulation, how to make that work. And I've had some fascinating discussions with secretaries who are in charge of such systems, and the discussion about how it cleans up the voter rolls, and understanding the process that we go through in issuing a credential, which is not a light lift, depending on the individual citizen that you're talking about. And as we, fought the unsuccessful fight at the barricades over the Real ID Act, one of the points that we tried to raise with the Department of Homeland Security was that, we can write any rule that we want. It's the exceptions that are going to keep us busy 18 hours a day. And we have dealt with individuals who were born on a farm. They worked on that farm their whole life, did not have a birth certificate, did not have a social security number, and then they had to go somewhere. And, working that one backwards to try to make sure that they had the right documentation to prove that they were an American citizen, it's hard to do without documentation. Those processes can be quite complex. However, once somebody completes it, and under our databases, they've shown that they are legally present in the country or they're an American citizen, it makes the completion of a registration process relative child's play at that point. And that sort of also, I think, underscores the need for a better understanding of our cybersecurity needs. We've already had a lengthy discussion here about financial needs for making the case for HAVA 2. Whether we meant to or not. But I think it all has to, I think what we ought to be focused on really long term, what the goals of this group are going to be. I would hope that the goals would be answering some of these questions that have been raised here today, affirmatively or negatively, and hoping to, having fully vet that discussion, that the systems that we do have that work very well are those to be emulated, and where there are gaps, that we can address them in ways, again, if there are opportunities, windows of opportunity for wrongdoing, especially if they've not been exploited, we should be able to say that as well. Like, we had an investigation in the state of Maine. There was an allegation that as many as 300 college students who are matriculated at our wonderful state system of higher education, but who had come from, other states in New England, lawless places like New Hampshire, for example, were registered in their home state, but also had registered to vote and voted in Maine. And what we discovered in that investigation was that, in fact, they had not voted in both states. And that answers a question. But I think the issue of registration in more than one state, I happen to have, handily enough, a voter registration card from the state of Maine. And part of what the registration process includes is the question, have you been previously registered to vote, yes or no, city, town, county, and state, even with a space for the phone number. It's really incumbent on the registrar of voters to then contact that jurisdiction and say, Chris Kobach has finally come to his senses and moved to Maine. He's no longer in Kansas. Whether or not that happens is the arguable point.
Right.
And the citizen participation, too, is key here. We have a legal obligation for citizens in Maine who hold driver's licenses to update their physical address on their credential within 15 days of a move. Nobody does it. I would hate to tell you that I didn't update my address for 15 years until I got called for jury duty and I had to go to the Hancock County Clerk of Courts with a hat in hand, so I didn't live in Hancock County anymore. So those are some of the pitfalls that face us, but I think we can answer those questions and then determine whether or not the apparent risks are actual risks. I think it'll help us inform the public. And I agree with Secretary Gardner about voter turnout. I'm not sure turnout can be our goal. We don't oversee municipal elections, but we do like to see the turnout. And we had a coastal town a couple years ago that had almost 95% turnout in the election, way above every other municipality in the state. So we made a phone call, said, what happened there? They had a leashed dog ordinance on the ballot. And everybody in town was at each other's throats and they all went out and voted. So you just never know what's going to drive people. It's not always the presidential election.
I'll take one or two more comments, then I'll try to summarize this topic. Go ahead.
Just a couple of points on Judge King's regarding the rules. The Election Assistance Commission does set voluntary voting system guidelines. 48 of the 50 states, 47 or 48 of the states use our guidelines in some way or another. They are voluntary, however, just because they're voluntary doesn't mean that the vendors don't have to meet them in order to get certified in other states where they're selling their equipment. As far as databases, what kind of equipment is being used and where, I know that we have some of that data. There are other groups that are collecting that data as well. So I think that we can probably get that data from different sources already, and at least a good amount of it. I know it's been kind of tough to follow up, at least for the EAC, to actually get that information because we do use so many different types of voting equipment across the country, and not every state dictates what its county should use, and so some places there are numerous types of equipment used within one state that is county-driven. The other thing I think that we should look at is who's being disenfranchised in our country. We hear that people are being disenfranchised. I just want to, as a point of order, to say that I distributed copies of our most recent election administration and voting survey to the commission. This is just an overview. The more detailed county-by-county information is on the Election Assistance Commission's website. But we did find out in this survey, for example, how many of our uniformed overseas citizens are voting or not voting, and there's some pretty disappointing numbers, in my opinion, there. And I'd like to look at who is actually being prevented from voting or not voting for whatever reason.
Okay, well, just to summarize, I didn't hear any objection to the 5 initial broad topics that I mentioned, and many of you commented adding to those topics. In addition, according to my notes, and I'm sure that our designated federal officer has even better notes, other topics cataloging how many elections have been decided by very close margins, double voting, causes for lack of participation and confidence in the elections, including perhaps seeking what data we might get from the Census Bureau. Automatic voter registration, pros and cons, experience in Arkansas and coming up in 2019 in Maine, recent legislative debate. The prosecution and identification of election crimes, resources available to that. And on the subject of resources, I think implicit in all of these is funding and equipment to address all of these issues. What databases are states using to verify the accuracy of their rolls? The jury duty list question and any information that is currently in the possession of the federal government that may not be disseminated to the states. Conviction information, our U.S. Attorney's offices sharing that data to the states where the conviction may disqualify a person from being a qualified voter in whatever state the conviction may occur. DHS forms where the person indicates that as a non-citizen they were registered to vote. And of course, the larger question of DHS databases that were mentioned that states have had very limited or even indeed virtually no access to ensure that non-citizens are on the rolls. And online registration and non-registration states like North Dakota. So if there's no objection, we've got really at least a dozen topics that perhaps we can ask staff to bunch together in coherent ways so that each meeting can address related topics, and hopefully we can start to dig much deeper into those related topics. The next topic on the agenda is future meetings. And I know in discussions with staff, the general idea has been that we should shoot for perhaps having 4 more public meetings with lots of staff work in between to collect information for us to assess. We may have more meetings than that if necessary, but I think 4 is at least a starting target. And of course, there may be additional topics that we choose to address. One of the things that was in that letter to the states was please answer some questions, and one of the questions was, what topics would you like us to address? So we may get suggestions from the responding states indicating a strong desire to dive into one topic or another. So we shouldn't consider these topics an exclusive list. These are simply the way we chart our course forward, and as this commission goes on, we can obviously amend topics that we would like to address. So if we start with the idea that we want to attempt to have 4 more meetings in the next I think we're talking in the next 9 months or so. The initial question is how soon would our next meeting be? There has been a suggestion that we try to meet before October 1st. So that we're middle of July right now, so we're talking about 2.5 months, sometime in the next 2.5 months to have that meeting. And then the next topic, and I'll throw this open to you on the subject of future meetings, is where to have those meetings. In discussing with staff and looking at the experiences of past commissions, indeed I testified in front of the Obama administration's commission on election administration, and if memory serves, I think that commission met in Alaska, if I'm not mistaken. It was somewhere on the West Coast. I may be mistaken, but at any rate, it was a very far-flung place, and I'm not suggesting that we necessarily go there. But I am suggesting that perhaps half of the future meetings be in places other than Washington, D.C. And so I'm welcoming suggestions as to where those places might be.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
I won't go into where the places might be, but I would suggest 2 things. One, and Hans underscored something for me, I had the pleasure of co-chairing the 2000 decennial census, or it was the U.S. Census Monitoring Board, and co-chaired with Tony Coelho, former member of Congress. And we were impressed with the data, the survey data that the census does collect on a variety of subjects. And so I actually think that I would underscore, given that we're going to have some time in between, because folks have other jobs that they attend to, that we get that document that Hans underscored. The other thing, I had the pleasure of serving on the Steny Hoyer, Bob Ney chaired HAVA committee that pushed the machines out, the dollars out for the machines. It was a pretty extensive study. What they looked at is probably not changed. What has changed is the technology has rapidly changed, and there's probably a need for us to, there's a need for states to be competitive for new injection of cash to buy these machines or to update technology. But I would think that you could get a hold of that last HAVA study and get it to us. It's some pretty interesting reading. There's some boring stuff in it, but there's some pretty interesting things where we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we have a baseline where we start from. Given that, I think that this is essentially an organization orientation meeting. I know this is a little shorter. I would suggest that we either the third week or near the end of August or the second week past Labor Day of September be the next meeting. I don't care if it's in Washington or Alaska again, but the reality is that I think that one of those weeks, the last week in August or the second week in September would be a good jumping off point, given that we might have to reduce the time between meetings if in fact we're going to have an impact in early next year.
Any other thoughts on scheduling?
Bar Harbor is always a good place to go to in September. But I think the timeline that you lay out, Mr. Vice Chair, is a reasonable one. I would say one other thing that, we've talked about cybersecurity and getting information in terms of communications. Maybe we should include the Congress in those communications. I know they're doing some investigation of some allegations about the involvement of the Russian Federation in some of our electoral systems, and maybe as they proceed with their investigations to keep us apprised of their findings would be very helpful to this commission.
Does that sound reasonable, the suggestion of Commissioner Blackwell that we maybe shoot for the end of August or the first half of September as a meeting time?
Just September would be better for me, just because our schedules fill up so quickly.
Same is true for me. But,
Let's do the second evening.
so first half, let's just say that after, and Secretary Gardner, does that sound reasonable? As far as locations, Bar Harbor is certainly one of my favorite places. But are there any strong, does anyone on the commission have a preference? Obviously, we will have more meetings in Washington, D.C. I anticipate that one thing we might want to consider doing is when the National Association of Secretaries of States has its February meeting in D.C., that might be a convenient time to have a future meeting in D.C. But are there any places that are on your minds? Yes.
I just suggest that we spread them out across the country geographically. So if we're in Maine, that we go someplace in the west, someplace in the south, someplace in the Midwest.
I don't have a particular preference, but I think one of the easiest things that we might be able to do is to spread them out across the country is to pick the cities that are, the regional headquarters for the federal government. So, for example, the Atlanta is really the headquarters for the southeast region of the federal government. That's where most of the big federal agencies that have offices in other areas, that's where they're headquartered. And the ease of that is that there are, of course, then federal buildings there we can use for the meeting, but that might be the easiest way to do that. I don't know what the regional headquarters are for, the Northwest, the Southwest, et cetera, but I would suggest we might want to use that.
And I would echo the point that Commissioner McCormick made about spreading these meetings around. One of the reasons is, of course, that the commissions traditionally welcome and facilitate public input. And if every meeting were on the East Coast, that wouldn't make it very easy for people in other parts of the country to provide any input if they wish to provide it in person. So we don't need to resolve that right now, but it sounds like there's a consensus that we should try to have some geographic diversity to our meeting locations. It sounds like the first half of September is the consensus for date. Are there any other topics you'd like to consider before we adjourn this first organizational meeting? All right, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned.